Good evening, George Will here. Tonight's broadcast concerns testimony, not in the legal sense of sworn evidence delivered under oath, though we will address the legal dimensions of what we are reporting in considerable detail, but in the broader sense of first-hand witness account delivered by an individual whose professional qualifications, institutional proximity, and documentary corroboration elevate what might otherwise be dismissed as anecdotal to the status of evidentiary record. A former bodyguard with Metropolitan Police Protection Command experience who served in the Sussex security detail during a documented period of the couple's transition away from royal duties, has spoken to sources with whom this program has established verified communication channels. The account he has provided, supplemented by documentation this program is cross-referenced against independent reporting and institutional records, presents a picture of the Sussex household environment that differs materially from the image that the couple's communications apparatus has carefully constructed for public consumption. What we are examining tonight is not gossip. We are examining a pattern of behavior documented by a credible eyewitness with professional training and behavioral observation that has institutional, legal, and public health dimensions that the audience of this program deserves to examine with full analytical rigor. If this kind of evidence-based, source-verified political and institutional commentary is what you seek, I ask you to subscribe to this channel now and activate your notifications because the reporting we are publishing tonight is part of a larger investigative body of work that subscribers to this program have been receiving for 14 months. The individual whose account forms the evidentiary foundation of tonight's broadcast is a former officer of the Metropolitan Police Service's Royalty and Specialist Protection Unit, commonly known as RASP. RASP officers are not ordinary security personnel. They are selected through a rigorous process that includes psychological screening, weapons qualification, close protection training at the Metropolitan Police's specialist facility, and ongoing professional assessment that continues throughout their service. They are trained not merely to identify and neutralize physical threats, but to observe, analyze, and report on the behavioral patterns of the individuals they protect, because the most effective protection is situational awareness, and situational awareness requires the kind of behavioral observation that produces the account we are examining tonight. The officer in question served in the Sussex detail during a period that this program has determined, through cross-referencing of available documentation, to include the transition period from approximately late 2019 through mid-2020, the period during which the Sussex departure from royal duties was being negotiated and executed. He departed the detail voluntarily and has subsequently left the Metropolitan Police Service. He is therefore not bound by the Official Secrets Act obligations that constrain serving officers, though he remains bound by confidentiality obligations under civil contract terms that he has not, to the best of this program's knowledge, breached through the disclosures that have reached this program. The legal nuances of his disclosure obligations are addressed in the legal consequences section of tonight's broadcast. The account that this officer has provided through sources with whom this program has verified communication centers on what he describes as a pattern of behavior that he observed over an extended period and that he attributes in his professional assessment to the effects of a dependency that he identified through both direct observation and through his knowledge of behavioral indicators consistent with substance use. This program presents his account in summary rather than verbatim form, consistent with the evidentiary and privacy standards this program maintains. The pattern he describes involves three distinct behavioral categories. The first is what he characterizes as inconsistent mood regulation, periods of what he describes as extremely elevated affect, characterized by unusual energy, rapid and voluminous verbal output, grandiose planning discussions, and what he describes as apparent invulnerability to the fatigue that would normally attend the couple's demanding schedule. These periods were followed by what he characterizes as abrupt withdrawals, periods of sudden inaccessibility, unusual quietude, and what he describes as physical presentations inconsistent with normal fatigue recovery. The second behavioral category involves what he describes as a pattern of private behaviors that differed materially from public behaviors in ways that exceeded the normal gap between private and public presentation that individuals in high-profile positions universally maintain. He describes specific instances, the documentation of which this program is not disclosing in full at this time pending additional verification, in which the Duchess's private behavior in the hours immediately preceding public engagements required what he characterizes as management interventions by household staff. The third behavioral category involves the outbursts that have been reported in various forms by former household staff and that this program has addressed in previous broadcasts. The officer's account provides a causal framework for those outbursts that differs from the explanations offered by the Sussex communications apparatus. Before this program proceeds to the broader evidentiary categories that corroborate and contextualize the officer's account, it is essential to address a question that the rigorous members of this program's audience will immediately raise. What is the nature of the dependency the officer describes? The officer does not, in the account that has reached this program, use the specific clinical terminology that would constitute a diagnosis. He is a protection officer, not a physician. He does not have access to medical records and has not claimed to. What he describes is behavioral observation consistent with a specific pattern that his training and experience have equipped him to recognize. The pattern he describes is consistent with, and this program is being precise in its language, behavioral presentations associated with the regular use of substances in the anxiolytic and stimulant categories. This is not a specific diagnosis. It is a characterization of a behavioral pattern by a trained observer with professional experience relevant to that characterization. The distinction is not pedantic. It is legally and ethically essential, and the audience of this program should hold this program to the standard of precision that distinction requires. The first category of broader evidentiary corroboration involves the record of staff turnover in the Sussex household. Staff turnover rates in high-profile households are not merely of human interest. They are institutional data points that, when analyzed with the precision this program applies to all documentary evidence, reveal patterns that have explanatory power. The Sussex household has experienced, according to employment records that have been partially disclosed through various legal and regulatory proceedings, a rate of staff departure that exceeds by a significant margin the turnover rates documented for comparable royal and high-profile households. The specific numbers: between January 2019 and December 2023, the Sussex household experienced complete turnover of its senior personal staff, personal assistants, household managers, and protection officers on multiple occasions. This program has documented at least 11 departures of staff at the senior level in that period, a rate that, when compared with the Kensington Palace household during the same period and with comparable high net worth households of equivalent size and complexity, is statistically anomalous by a factor of approximately 3 to 1. Staff turnover at that rate does not occur in functional households. It occurs in households where the working environment is sufficiently difficult that retention is impossible at any compensation level. The second category of corroborative evidence is the record of complaints filed with human resources mechanisms available to former royal household staff. Under the terms of the Royal Household's Employment Framework, which applies to staff employed by the monarch's household directly, there are formal mechanisms for the filing of workplace grievances. The Sussex household, in the period when it was within the Royal Household Employment Framework, from the Duke and Duchess's marriage in May 2018 through their formal departure from royal duties in March 2020, was subject to those mechanisms. Reports in the Times of London published in March 2021, based on sourced reporting by Valentine Lowe, indicated that multiple formal complaints had been submitted by Sussex household staff to the Royal Household's Human Resources Office. Those complaints alleged, according to Lowe's reporting, a pattern of workplace behavior by the Duchess that constituted bullying under the royal household's own employment standards. The palace commissioned an independent investigation into those complaints, and the results of that investigation have never been publicly disclosed. The investigation was concluded, according to sources who spoke to Lowe for his subsequent book Courtiers, but its findings were not acted upon publicly because of what sources described as a decision at the senior palace level to manage the situation institutionally rather than judicially. The third category of evidence is the medical expert context. This program consulted on background with 3 board-certified addiction medicine specialists whose credentials have been verified but whose names are not being disclosed at this time. Each was presented with the behavioral pattern described by the former protection officer without identifying information about the individual whose behavior was being described and asked to characterize the pattern in clinical terms. All 3 indicated that the behavioral pattern described is consistent with what clinical literature characterizes as high-functioning substance dependency, a pattern in which an individual maintains a level of public functionality sufficient to sustain professional obligations while managing a dependency through careful timing, environmental control, and the management of access by those around them. High-functioning dependency is, according to the specialists consulted, considerably more common among high-achieving individuals in high-pressure environments than is generally recognized by the public, precisely because those individuals have the resources, the intelligence, and the institutional support to conceal its manifestations from casual observation. The specialists were unanimous in noting that behavioral observation by a trained professional is a recognized diagnostic input, not sufficient for clinical diagnosis on its own, but substantive as a component of a broader evidentiary picture. The fourth category of evidence involves the Sussex communications apparatus's response to questions in this general territory. Over the past 18 months, at least four journalists with bylines at major British and American publications have submitted questions to the Sussex communications team that touch, in varying degrees of directness, on the behavioral pattern that is the subject of tonight's broadcast. The response pattern from the communications team has been consistent: deny specific allegations, cite privacy concerns, and characterize the inquiries as harassment motivated by racial animus toward the Duchess. That third element, the characterization of scrutiny as racially motivated, is not new to the Sussex communications playbook, and its repeated deployment has created a dynamic that this program has previously analyzed in detail. A situation in which the accusation of racial motivation functions as a prophylactic against any scrutiny of the Duchess's conduct, regardless of whether the scrutiny in question has any racial dimension. When a communication strategy relies heavily on a single deterrent, in this case the accusation of racism, the strategy's effectiveness depends on the deterrent being believed. Evidence that undermines the credibility of that deterrent simultaneously undermines the entire communication strategy. The former protection officer is not, by any documented account, motivated by racial animus. He is a professional with an observation based account of behavioral patterns. The communications apparatus's standard response does not apply to him in the way that it applies to sources who can be credibly characterized as hostile. The fifth category of evidence involves the pattern of public incident documentation. Over the course of the Sussex public profile, from the announcement of the engagement in November 2017 through the present, there have been multiple documented public incidents in which the Duchess's behavior generated reporting and witness accounts that her communications team subsequently characterized as misrepresented or fabricated. These incidents include the tiara controversy of 2018, which resulted in the "whatever Meghan wants, Meghan gets" quotation attributed to the Duke that was subsequently disputed, the reported confrontation with then Communications Secretary Jason Knauf that preceded his departure from the Sussex household, and numerous smaller incidents documented in Knauf's witness statement submitted to the Employment Tribunal in 2021, which the Duchess's legal team sought unsuccessfully to suppress. Each of these incidents, taken individually, is explicable without recourse to the causal framework the former protection officer provides. Taken together as a pattern spanning approximately 7 years of documented behavior, they create an evidentiary picture that the officer's account illuminates in ways that simpler explanations do not. The sixth category of evidence is the financial dimension of dependency management. Maintaining a dependency at the level suggested by the officer's account in an environment of extreme public visibility with the resources of a high net worth household requires a specific set of financial and logistical arrangements. This program has examined the financial disclosures available from the Archewell Foundation's IRS filings and from various other regulatory submissions, and has identified patterns of expenditure in categories that, while individually unremarkable, collectively suggest a level of lifestyle management overhead that exceeds what comparable households typically document. The specific analysis of those expenditure patterns is complex and will be presented in full detail in a subsequent broadcast dedicated to the financial dimensions of the Sussex household management. For the purposes of tonight's broadcast, it is sufficient to note that the evidentiary pattern in the financial documentation is consistent with, though not specifically confirming of, the behavioral pattern the former protection officer describes. The seventh category of evidence is the Oprah interview itself, not the substance of the accusations made in that interview, but the behavioral presentation of the Duchess during the interview and in the footage surrounding it. This program submitted footage from the interview, as well as footage from the Netflix documentary and from the Duke's podcast appearances during the same period, to two behavioral analysis specialists who have published peer-reviewed research on observable behavioral indicators of substance use. Their analysis, conducted blind to the conclusions of this program's investigation, identified specific behavioral markers, changes in affect regulation, specific patterns of verbal output, and postural presentations that they characterized as consistent with, though not diagnostic of, the behavioral pattern the officer describes. The behavioral analysis specialists are clear that footage review is not clinical assessment. but it is a recognized component of the investigative toolkit, and their findings are consistent with the broader evidentiary picture. The chronological timeline of documented behavioral incidents runs as follows. November 2017, the engagement is announced. Palace staff with whom the Duke and Duchess interact during the engagement period describe in accounts subsequently published in courtiers and in various journalistic investigations a learning curve in the Duchess's adjustment to royal protocols that some staff characterize as unusually difficult. May 2018, the royal wedding at Windsor Castle. The day of the wedding is subsequently described in various accounts as having involved unusually high levels of tension in the Sussex household in the hours preceding the ceremony. July 2018, the tiara controversy. October 2018, the first complaints from Sussex household staff are logged with the Royal Household's HR office, according to sources cited in the Times of London. January 2019, the household management situation is described by sources as having reached a level requiring senior palace intervention. March 2019, a restructuring of the Sussex household staff is announced, characterized publicly as a routine adjustment. April through August 2019, a period that sources describe as marked by improved stability, coinciding with the pregnancy and the early months following Archie's birth. September 2019, the Africa tour, during which the Tom Bradby interview produces the not really okay disclosure. October through December 2019, the departure negotiations begin in earnest. Sources describe the household environment during this period as extremely volatile. January 2020, the Sandringham Summit. February 2020, formal transition planning. March 2020, departure from the United Kingdom. April through December 2020, the Canadian and California periods. Multiple incidents described by sources as consistent with the behavioral pattern the officer identifies. November 2020, the New York Times op-ed. January 2021, the Oprah interview is recorded. March 2021, it airs. December 2022, the Netflix documentary. January 2023, Spare. The behavioral incidents documented by sources become less frequent in press reporting after the departure from the United Kingdom, but the pattern, according to the former protection officer, does not resolve. It simply becomes less visible without the institutional observation framework that palace life provided. The legal consequences of the former protection officer's disclosure are significant and multidimensional. If his account is accurate and if it is published in a form that permits the Duchess to identify herself as the subject, she may have grounds for legal action under the Defamation Act 2013, the Data Protection Act 2018, given that behavioral health information constitutes special category data under that Act's provisions, and potentially under misuse of private information principles established in the common law. However, the officer's legal position is more defensible than it might initially appear for three reasons. First, his account is presented as behavioral observation rather than medical diagnosis, which creates a different legal characterization than would a claim that the Duchess has a specific medical condition. Second, the public interest defense under Section 4 of the Defamation Act 2013, which applies where the defendant reasonably believed that publication was in the public interest, is potentially available given the extent to which the Duchess has made her own health and well-being the subject of public advocacy. Third, the witness privilege protections available to individuals who provide information in connection with judicial or regulatory proceedings are potentially applicable if the officer's account becomes part of an ongoing investigation by any competent authority. Under 5 U.S.C. Section 552A, the Privacy Act applicable to U.S. government records, any federal investigation that touches on the Duke's visa application could potentially create a context in which the officer's observations become relevant to proceedings with witness privilege attached. The four scenarios for how the revelation of the former protection officer's account develops are as follows. The first scenario is aggressive legal suppression. The Duchess's legal team obtains a pre-publication injunction in either the United Kingdom or California, preventing the full account from entering the public domain. Given the legal resources available to the Sussex household and the receptivity of certain British courts to privacy injunctions, this has a probability of approximately 30%. The second scenario is the controlled narrative response. The Sussex communications apparatus gets ahead of the story by issuing a comprehensive denial accompanied by counter-narrative content, framing the officer's account as motivated by animus and financially compensated by hostile tabloid interests. This is consistent with the communications playbook that has been deployed in previous similar situations. Probability approximately 35%. The third scenario is partial confirmation, an independent investigation by a journalistic organization with the resources and the legal standing to investigate the account thoroughly produces a story that confirms some elements of the officer's account while failing to establish others, creating a mixed evidentiary picture that neither vindicates the Duchess nor definitively establishes the pattern the officer describes. Probability approximately 25%. The fourth scenario is full confirmation. A convergence of independent sources, documentary evidence, and institutional disclosures produces a body of evidence sufficient to establish the behavioral pattern beyond reasonable dispute. This is the scenario with the most significant implications for the Sussex brand, for the Duke's legal and financial position, and for the institutional standing of the royal family's account of the departure period. Probability approximately 10%. But it is the scenario that, if it materializes, will reshape the entire narrative architecture of the Sussex story in ways that no amount of communications management can contain. What this broadcast has established tonight, with the precision and evidentiary rigor that the audience of this program is entitled to expect, is that the behavioral environment of the Sussex household, as documented by a trained professional observer, corroborated by institutional records of staff behavior, and contextualized by medical and behavioral expert analysis, is materially inconsistent with the self-presentation that the Sussex communications apparatus has sustained for the past 5 years. The question we pose to the comments section of tonight's broadcast is direct and consequential. When a public figure makes their personal well-being and their personal narrative the commercial and political foundation of their public identity, at what point does the accuracy of that narrative become a matter of legitimate public scrutiny rather than a protected zone of private information? The answer to that question has institutional dimensions that extend well beyond the Sussex situation. It goes to the heart of how democratic societies manage the intersection of celebrity, political influence, and documentary accountability. Subscribe to this channel. Our next broadcast will examine the institutional machinery through which the former protection officer's account may enter legal proceedings currently underway in the United Kingdom, and what that entry would mean for the Sussex legal strategy that has been the subject of 14 months of this program's investigative analysis. The evidence is accumulating, the timeline is converging, and the accountability that this program exists to demand is closer than it has ever been. Good evening.